Hello, I'm John Stainsby. In this lesson, we're going to cover tenancy configuration basics for data science. While this is common knowledge and most likely just a refresher for you, let's quickly discuss basic tenancy configuration concepts. Compartments. These are logical containers for organizing OCI resources. User groups, simply a group of users. Dynamic groups are special groups of resource principals. And policies, which are used to grant access to groups within compartments. Let's quickly discuss how these components work together to enable access to data science resources. Firstly, you assign users to appropriate user groups. Secondly, you create dynamic groups for data science resources. And finally, you create policies that grant access to data science resources within a compartment. Starting then with compartments. They allow you to organize and control access to your cloud resources. A compartment is a logical grouping of resources that can be accessed only by certain groups that have been given permission by an administrator. When configuring your tenancy, the first step is to make a plan of how you will organize your data science resources going forward. Once you've made a plan, you can start creating one or many compartments. We will demonstrate this at the end of the lesson. However, for now, let's look at the quick and easy three-step process to create a compartment. From the Identity console, go to Identity and select Compartments. Click Create a Compartment, enter a name and description, and then click Create Compartment. Now, moving on to user groups, which are individual users that are grouped in OCI and granted access to data science resources within compartments. Admins can perform three simple steps to create user groups. Firstly, create the users. Secondly, create the groups. And finally, add users to groups. When configuring groups, first decide how users will access resources in the compartments. Now, for a special type of group called dynamic groups that contain resources that match rules that you define. Resources such as data science notebook sessions, job runs, and model deployments can be included in a dynamic group. These matching rules allow group membership to change dynamically as resources that match those rules are created or deleted. These resources act as principal actors. They can make API calls to services according to policies that you write for the dynamic group. We'll discuss policies shortly. For example, using the resource principal of a data science notebook session, where its dynamic group has a policy which enables object storage access, you could make a call to the object storage API to read data from a bucket. So, resources match rules, and rules are applied to dynamic groups. Once you give your dynamic group a name and description, you'll fill in the following matching rules, where the compartment OCID is replaced by the identifier of the compartment you created for data science. In this example, with these rules, the dynamic group will be made up of any and all resources of these three types that exist in the compartment. What those resources have access to do, as mentioned before, will depend upon policies. Policies define what principals, like users and resources, have access to in OCI. Access is granted at the group and the compartment level, which means you can write a policy that gives a group a specific type of access within a specific compartment. Policies have a basic syntax. Allow a group called your group name to do some verb or action upon a resource type within a compartment named compartment name. Let's look a bit closer at each of these variables in the syntax. Group name, this will be filled in with the name of the user group or dynamic group. Verb, this will define the level of access. We will look at different verb types next. Resource type, this will specify the type of resource or resource family to be accessed. And compartment name, this will be filled in with the name of the compartment. Verbs define the level of access that would be permitted to the resource or resource family. Verbs include, from least to most permissive, inspect, which gives the ability to list resources without access to any user-specified metadata. Read includes inspect plus the ability to get user-specified metadata and the actual resource itself. Use includes read plus the ability to work with the resource, including updating it. Generally, this does not include creating or deleting permissions. And finally, manage. includes all permissions, including creating and deleting. Resource type in the policy defines which specific resource you are writing the policy for. For example, data science includes resources such as data science models or data science jobs. You can write a policy for individual resource types. However, to make writing policies for related resources much easier, there are aggregate resource types, which contain a family of related resources. The aggregate resource type for data science is data science family. We are adding the color coding to make the syntax easier to understand here. But please note, these are actually the most critical of the required data science policies, not simply policy examples. The first required policy will be to allow data scientists to manage all data science resources in a specific compartment. To do this, your policy would say, allow your user group to manage data science family in your compartment name. The second required policy is to allow data science resources, such as a notebook session, in a dynamic group you've created to manage all data science resources. So this time, allow a dynamic group to manage data science family in your compartment name. The following policies are required to enable user access to metrics and logging for data science resources. First, allow your user group to read metrics in compartment name. Secondly, allow dynamic groups to use log content in your compartment. Thirdly, allow your user group to manage log groups in your compartment. And finally, allow your user group to use log content in your compartment. If you plan to use custom networking in data science, which is discussed in depth in the next lesson, you will need the following policies. Allow the service data science to use virtual network family in your compartment. Allow your user group to use virtual network family in compartment. And allow dynamic group to use virtual network family in compartment. The following policies are useful for accessing services related to data science, so you might find it useful to pause the lesson here and take note of them. To create a compartment from the Identity console, go to Compartments and click Create Compartment. Give your compartment a name and give it a description. In this example, I'm adding tags to keep my workspace clean and tidy. Click Create Compartment and wait a few moments for your compartment to be created. You may want to take note of the OCID of the compartment for later. To create a user, in the Identity console, navigate to Users and click Create User. Give your user a username and add a description. You can also add the email address of the user and then repeat this process for every user that you want to add. Click Create. Next, we'll create a group for our users. From the Identity console, go to Groups and click Create Group. Give your group a name and add a description. Then click Create. Once we have a user group created, we can begin to add users to the group. Click Add User to Group and then select your user and click Add. Repeat this process for all the users you want to add to this user group. Now moving on to dynamic groups. From the Identity console, go to Dynamic Groups and click Create Dynamic Group. Give your dynamic group a name and a description. Now we're going to enter some matching rules. And remember, we looked at the 3 important matching rules for data science resources. The first rule is for data science notebook sessions. The second rule is for data science model deployments. And the third rule is for data science job runs. And we're replacing the compartment ID with the compartment we created earlier in the demo. Click Create to create your dynamic group. Now, for the final step, we need to allow our resources and users to access data science in our compartment. So we're going to create a policy. Now, in this policy, I'm going to cover the required data science policies. So I'm giving it a relevant name and description. In the policy builder, I'm going to switch to the manual editor to allow me to paste in my policy statements. Once I've added those statements, I'll click Create to create the policy. Now, there were a few additional required policies specifically for users and dynamic groups to access metrics. So I'm going to edit this policy now and add additional statements that will allow access for my user group to read metrics in the compartment, for my dynamic group to access log content, for my user group to access log groups, and finally for my user group to access log content. And once I've added these statements, I'll save my changes. Now that we've covered the required policies, we did show some useful policies that it may be good to create as well, especially when you want resources or users within a data science service to be able to access other OCI services. So in this case, I'm adding some useful data science policies. Again, I'm giving a name and a description and switching to the manual editor to add my policies. These policies are specific for object storage, and so I want to allow both my dynamic group and my user group to manage the object family in my compartment. I can repeat this process for all the policies I want to add. So, to wrap up, we discussed tenancy configuration concepts like compartments, user groups, dynamic groups, and policies. We talked about matching rules for grouping resources into dynamic groups. We covered policy syntax for setting your policies. We discussed the required data science policies. We talked about policies for data science related services, and then covered some optional data science policies you might find useful. Thank you.